Hi, my name is Gorm, and together with my co-authors, Frederic Leymarie, William Latham, Takaya Arita, and Reiji Suzuki, we're proud to present our star, Virtual Creature Morphology, our review. In this paper, we present a review of methods for the procedural generation of virtual creatures. As procedural content generation methods gain popularity, we now realize that not only humans can initiate creation. Research fields such as mixed initiative co-creative interfaces are introducing computational agents as full creators and collaborators. This review is uniting a number of fields that would typically be separate: ALife, games, and the arts. When artists design and model creatures, they're often inspired by real-life animals and anatomy. While a human studies anatomy and existing works to get better at their job, what will the computer study to get better at understanding creature morphology? Increasingly, with the rising popularity of machine learning in other fields, the answer has been that the computer studies what the human studies. However, except for the work of Thor and Berst, described later in this paper, this isn't an approach that has gained momentum when it comes to modeling creature morphology. Instead, the machine can learn about anatomy through physical simulation and evolving forms. This approach started with the works of Carl Sims and has remained popular to this day. This paper will describe many such methods in detail. Before we move on, here's the agenda for today's presentation. As this is a star presentation, it'll be a bit long. But first, we'll go into the semantics and the frameworks that we have applied. Then, after a short section of previous work, we'll talk about early works in the field, and then start going through the methods. The majority of the earlier part is dominated by the ALife methods, with a few game-specific things in between. Then we're going to talk about one game that has made a lot of impact on procedural content, on procedural creature generation, Spore. Then we're going to talk about some more artful projects, and then in the end, before going on to the conclusion, I'll show you an overview of the simulations and ecosystems we discuss in the paper. We won't discuss them here because there's no time. And the same with comparisons between different genotype representations. And finally, there's a conclusion, and we'll talk about future developments. This presentation will feel a bit like a marathon because we're going to cover a lot. It's a long presentation. And because of the format of the presentation, that we have to make a video, there's been some copyright issues, so it's difficult to add as many images from different papers that I would have liked to. So it's going to be a bit texty. I apologize for that as a conference like the Eurographics, but hopefully it'll still be informative. Okay, so moving on. Some papers use the term evolutionary virtual creature, E or EVC, for the generated creatures. Others use the term animate. While animates do not have to be evolutionarily generated, EVCs and animates both refer to animated creatures or animals. In the context of this review, we will use the term animate, as it is a slightly broader term than EVC. A single paper referred to their creations not as creatures, but as inspired by Breitenberg vehicles, are virtual agents, which mean virtual agents moving around in an environment using sensors. With a few exceptions, all of the EVCs and animates in this review can be seen as generalized Breitenberg vehicles, as most move around in a virtual environment using sensors. Growing virtual creatures and making them come to life is a vast and complex undertaking involving many disciplines and techniques, such as making the morphology look believable for a specific context, animating the creature, generating the morphology, and simulating behaviors. For this review, we're focusing solely on procedural generation of virtual creature morphology. Much work has been done on the behavioral side with the research on procedurally or computational assisted animation, while relatively little work is focused on morphology. Therefore, the main focus of this study is on the analysis of algorithms for the design of the morphology of virtual creatures. Where relevant and intrinsically interlinked with morphology, this study also describes the behavioral side of an algorithm. While there has been a lot of work on evolving physical robots, our work is focused squarely on virtual creatures. However, The design of physical robots often happens through evolving virtual robots in simulators. In our review, we include such works in robotics when the main focus remains on the virtual simulation. Humans are the only type of creatures deliberately left out of the survey, as it is quite a considerable area that deserves its own treatment and has to deal with its own particular set of problems, such as the uncanny valley. Except for not considering humans, we have not discriminated against any other type of creatures and have included animals such as fish. To the best of the author's knowledge, there has been no recent survey focusing on the morphology of virtual creatures, although some related work has appeared. Cithia et al.'s survey of nature-inspired intelligent robots includes papers on morphological evolution. However, its focus is mainly on physical robotics. Additionally, the paper gives a good introduction to concepts often used in evolutionary computation, such as genetic algorithms, neural networks, and L systems. Similarly, Pollack et al. Describe a series of works that include morphological evolution, but their focus is on a chronological historical description of the work of the lab the authors belong to. We have only deemed the last of those lab works relevant for this review. It is described more in depth in section 4 on L systems in the paper. Recently, Shah et al. Published a survey on methods for shape-changing robots. They include simulation methods, and their focus is on applications that translate to physical robotics. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the morphology of creatures without mentioning the books On the Origin of Species by Darwin and On Growth and Form by D'Arcy Thompson. While both works were written before the advent of digital simulation, both have been hugely influential. Darwin laid the foundations of the evolutionary theory that so many works in this review base themselves on. D'Arcy Thompson instead focused on the connection between form and pressure from physical forces, coming up with explanations for a multitude of the spectacular forms we see in nature. While the works of Darwin and D'Arcy Thompson are at times juxtaposed against each other, it is more accurate to say they work at two different levels of abstraction, or as Thompson puts it when paraphrasing Aristoteles, the house is there that men may live in it, but it is also there because the builders have laid one stone upon another, meaning there can be many reasons for the house. So, Conway's Cellular Automaton Game of Life from 1970 has an evocative, lifelike look that, when simulated, reminds us of cells in a petri dish. Depending on the start configuration of the cells, you can have simulation where it looks like life forms are walking across the screen, commonly known as gliders, and other interesting forms. This evocative look comes from obeying 4 simple rules that determine if a cell is dead or alive. Though Conway is the person most often associated with cellular automata, John von Neumann and Stanislav Ulam invented the concept while working at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Von Neumann's original notes are from 1948. Another researcher not often mentioned is Nils Barichelli. Barichelli was one of the first researchers to bridge cellular automata to ALife, as his evolutionary simulations and organic-looking grid-based setups were clearly reminiscent of cellular automata and seemed to foreshadow Conway's Game of Life. In 1983, Stephen Wolfram published a treatise focusing largely on one-dimensional cellular automata. Wolfram describes cellular automata through the bit pattern they produce. For example, the rules for Rule 30 produce the base 2 number for 30, as seen in Table 1 in our paper. We see that mathematically this rule is the same as the middle cell or the middle cell ORed with the right cell, parentheses around us, and then that result is exclusively ORed with the contents of the left cell. While many rules quickly produce regular repetitive patterns, Rule 30 is of particular interest because its output is chaotic looking and difficult to predict. It's often called the chaos rule. Leymarie systems, L systems were first formalized by Aristide Leymarie in 1968 as a method for simulating plant cells and modeling cellular growth. But as we will see later, L systems have also been used for modeling virtual creatures. An L system can be described by the tuple G, which consists of 3 parts, the V, omega, and P, where V is the alphabet, omega is the starting symbol or symbols, and P is the set of possible productions. In computer graphics, the easiest way of visualizing L systems is to imagine a turtle that draws lines between symbols with a set length between them. Additionally, some symbols will direct the turtle to turn a certain number of degrees. Imagine, for example, how this can be used for drawing tree-like structures. Using a turtle to draw and visually represent L systems was first introduced by Przesinkiewicz, who also introduced square brackets into the grammar as a way of representing pushing and popping a state on or off a stack of states. Especially for drawing operations, a stack of states simplifies things a lot, as the turtle doesn't have to be turned and directed towards a previous location to go back. Works on virtual creatures using L systems will be further elaborated on in section 4 in the paper. Chomsky discovered Chomsky hierarchies in 1956, some years before L systems, and the two are closely related. One of the main differences between the two is that while the latter are evaluated in parallel, Chomsky hierarchies are evaluated sequentially. Growth, or growth rational object work theorem. As everything in nature, this is also a recursive acronym. So growth. Growth is a program for automatically generating spiral organic structures. Kawaguchi describes a program that can generate spiral structures such as horns, shells, some plants, claws, and tusks. Kawaguchi's observation, which is similar to Latham and Todd's later approach, focuses on how shapes are generated in nature rather than on the exact geometric measurements. The result is very organic-looking shapes. Kawaguchi focuses on local changes and how many local changes can result in an overall global look. On this slide, you can see the basic rules that Kawaguchi describes in his paper for evolving a form. Unfortunately, the SIGGRAPH video is not publicly available, but do try to seek it out. So, in 1986, Richard Dawkins published his influential book, The Blind Watchmaker, which describes a computer program that simulates and evolves shapes called biomorphs. Dawkins was inspired by the zoologist and painter Desmond Morris, who called the figures in his paintings biomorphs. Watchmaker's interface works by having the user select one form out of a number of options, and then that form is chosen as a parent for the next generation of forms that the user can again select from, and so on. A little bit later, Todd and Latham calls this gardening, as the computer is creating something and the human works as a gardener, selecting, weeding out the things that they don't like and selecting the things that they like. The original source code for Watchmaker is still available, and the screenshots here are taken from a re-implementation in Java that's also available at the same location. Dawkins biomorphs have 9 genes. Dawkins doesn't use crossover for his evolutionary algorithms, only mutation, so each biomorph has only a single parent. Offspring differ from their parent only in that one of the 9 genes are modified by plus or minus 1. Excuse me for a second. Haggerty's interview with Latham and Todd describes the origins of Mutator, the pair's groundbreaking work. The roots of Mutator go back to a big 10 by 2 meter rule-based form synth drawing created by the artist William Latham at the Royal College of Arts in 1985. He was inspired by evolutionary techniques, starting with a basic shape, cone, cube, cylinder, sphere, or torus, and applying a series of simple transformations to them: beak, bulge, scoop, stretch, twist, and unite. The results are organic-looking composite shapes whose evolution are mapped out on the enormous drawing. Later, William Latham used a similar solid modeling program, the Winchester Solid Modeler, at the IBM Research Center in Winchester, before teaming up with Stephen Todd to create the Mutator program. In Mutator, as we saw with Dawkins, The human user performs the role of the fitness function. For each generation, the program presents 9 forms to the user, who then chooses which one becomes the next generation's parent, which is what Latham taught called gardening. In the context of this survey, the most interesting part of their work is the Mutate application. It generates organic, biologically inspired forms, together with its companion program, Lifecycle, and Director, animated films illustrating the life cycle, birth, growth, and death of biologically looking forms can be made. Mutator, which is a system of operators used to create the film The Evolution of Forms, is inspired by biomorphs and FormSense. FormSense was a system of rules used to generate the forms. Part of a painting drawn using the FormSense rules can be seen in figure 2 in the paper, or as illustrated on the previous slide. FormBuild was an initial attempt at making a digital version of FormSense. In FormBuild, constructed shapes consisted of two components, an attachment point on the original shape, and a new geometric shape, cones, cylinder, cube, or sphere, which will expand the original shape at the attachment point. Unlike FormSense, FormBuild only supported a single operation, add. FormBuild was later replaced by the more complete FormGrow, with a richer set of 3D transformations such as twist, bend, stack, branch, cage, and add. Built on the ideas of FormGrow and Richard Dawkins' biomorphs, Mutator uses evolutionary algorithms to create vastly more organic-looking shapes. You can see on this slide. Sims, in a seminal work, uses evolutionary algorithms to generate simple 3D articulated animal forms, or as we will call them, animates. Note that Sims did not himself use the word animates. It was popularized until 3 years later. In Sims' work, evolving the animates consisted of 5 parts: a fitness function, 2, a directed graph, where each node represents an oriented box or a limb, and each edge in the graph represents a joint. Third is there are local neural networks inside each joint that drives the movement of the joint. The fourth is there's also a global neural network, the output of which is used as parameters to local neural networks situated in the joints. 5. There are sensors to drive additional input to the neural networks. A directed node graph represents the genotype of an animate. This graph can be transformed into a phenotype by mapping the nodes into oriented boxes and the edges into joints between those oriented boxes. Each node in the graph is a data structure describing attributes such as the dimensions, joint type, connections to other nodes, and a network of neurons in what is essentially a compositional pattern producing network, or CPPN. Sims does not use the term CPPN, as the term wasn't coined until 13 years later by Stanley, though neither does he use the term artificial neural network, or ANN, or just neural network. Instead, he uses the word neuron. Stanley et al. State that ANNs and CPPNs function almost the same way, except that CPPNs have a greater range of choice for the node activation functions. However, the authors still insist that CPPNs should be seen as a specialization of ANNs, as the primary purpose of CPPNs is to describe mathematical functions that define shape and not to emulate the brain, as is the purpose of artificial neural networks. Sims creations have inspired a plethora of research. We'll give examples of 3 of those here in this presentation. First, Ray's art-inspired creature zoo is in most ways a faithful re-implementation and reproduction of Sims methods. An animate's genotype is initialized by generating a random number of nodes representing box limbs with random sizes and colors. Each limb has a random number of outgoing connections to other boxes, though boxes can have only one parent. Ray added a number of additional sensors such as time, color, velocity, etc., and this implementation allows for self-intersection, which means that these self-intersections are ignored by the physics simulation. The author implemented a fitness function based on following another object, Many of the animats described in the paper are found through random selection and the author's personal affinity for and desire to follow the fitness of an object. The author evolved some interesting shapes, not usually highlighted in papers reproducing Sim's work. An interesting note is that Ray chose Math Engine for physics integration and ended up with a common problem of numerical instabilities. The forces in the joint simply ended up becoming too big to keep the object together and would finally explode, causing the object to travel too far. Ray turned math into art by selecting the exploding creatures for breeding so that the simulation time before explosion would increase, in the end getting to a point where the joints would visibly push apart before being pulled back in place by the mathematical simulation. Latham modeled their creatures' morphology directly on Sims, though they chose not to explicitly support symmetry, and also created a new behavior controller based on classifiers. The authors successfully tested their work in 7 different situations: walking on a flat plane in any direction, walking in a specific direction on a flat floor, navigating trenches, climbing stairs, walking on a height field, skating, and cooperating via pushing a block. Latham used the brief simulation environment engine. Unfortunately, the authors did not make a direct comparison between their classifier system and a system based on Sim's neural networks. Lastly, Schimidal expanded Sim's work by producing a series of papers on generating flying creatures. To this end, Schimidal used a restricted and modified version of Sim's genome and phenotypes. Only 2 types of joints are used: hinge and ball socket. Hinges are always used between wing segments, while a ball socket is used between the wing root and the body root. 3 types of sensors are used. The first one measures the angle of a joint. The second is a joint stop indicating whether a joint has reached its limit. And the third is a gyroscope. Lessinidal published a series of works on a method they call encapsulation, syllabus, and pandemonium, or ESP. For the morphology, Lessinidal adds the ability to develop photoreceptors as well as muscles. Sims also describes works where animats are able to follow a light source, but unlike this work, his photoreceptors are fixed to exactly 3 input signals. In the work by Lessinidal, animats can have any number of photosensors, and they can be evolved at any part of any segment. Additionally, instead of applying forces on joints, the ESP method introduces muscles, which are essentially springs where the end points are attached to 2 different segments. Just like joints, they connect parent and child segments. While the morphological changes described above are interesting in themselves, a valuable contribution comes from the realization that the development of morphology and behavior can happen in separate steps. The basic idea is that different behaviors, or skills as the authors call them, can be evolved even as the basic morphology of segments and joints are kept fixed. ESP consists of 3 elements: encapsulation, syllabus, and pandemonium. The syllabus for an animat is a directed graph of skills. Once one of the skills in a syllabus have been learned, encapsulation is used for storing the neural network that models a particular skill. The network is modified slightly so that skills can be selectively activated. Finally, a mechanic is added to prioritize between those behaviors where it's not always obvious which one has priority. It is up to the designer of the syllabus graph to show who has priority in pandemonium. In the next video, the author, Den Lessin, will show a small snippet of the video.
This paper presents a method to finally break that barrier by adding 3 new components to a basic UVC system: a syllabus, encapsulation, and pandemonium. First, a human-designed syllabus is created, which breaks a complex learning task into a sequence of smaller subtasks. Second, once a subskill's evolution is complete, an automated encapsulation process is applied, preserving the skill as evolution continues, and also making it easily accessible to future evolution, by allowing it to be activated and deactivated as a unit. Finally, pandemonium allows a human user to place subskills into a winner-take-all competitive groups when it is known that only one of these skills can be usefully employed at any given time.
Okay, so the authors also made a small video game based on the techniques of ESP. They call it Darwin's Avatars. Darwin's Avatars is a two-player game where each player controls their own animate and competes to reach the end of a straight piece of racetrack first. Additionally, the goal must be reached within a set time. So if one or both players fail to reach the end of the track, the player who got closest to the goal wins. The time limit depends on the type of creature used for the race. The game offers three kinds of different creatures, though both players must be using the same type. The player's avatar has been evolved through the ESP method just described. For the computer player, both the morphology and the behavior is used. In contrast, for the human player, only the creature's morphology is kept, as the human makes the avatar move via a keyboard interface in a way reminiscent of QWOP or Encoding. The difference is that in Encoding there are only two keys to control a creature, while in Darwin's avatars each key is connected to independent muscles, though they can be mapped to overlap. So this scheme complicates the controls. Though the scheme complicates the controls, it gives the user the same amount of conceptual control as the neural network controlled brain. Here we see a presentation of the game.
So in this one, I'm controlling the creature in the front, and the one in the back is being controlled by the brain that this creature evolved. You'll see how much better it is than me. I moved backwards a little and then I crashed.
So, historically in computer graphics, Lindenmayer systems or L systems have typically been used for modeling plants. The foundations of L systems are described in the early works section in this paper, and we just talked about it earlier in this presentation. Hornby et al. Used a combination of L systems and evolutionary algorithms for generating vertical creatures that could be produced directly as physical robots. The authors used a parametric context-free L system. For the evolutionary algorithm, the authors typically used 100 individuals in a run of the simulation. This went on for no more than 100 generations. Given two parents, the crossover of P0 and P1 works by replacing a subpart of P0's command with a subpart of P1's command and copying that to the new offspring. Mutations can modify both production rules as well as the commands used to create the creature. As usual, the fitness function measures how far the center of mass of the creature has moved. Because of the stick-like look, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that Fram sticks are built using L systems. However, part of the purpose of the FramSticks project is to support different genotype encodings and examine the effect they have on the development process. The FramSticks model manual lists 10 different genotype formats and describes 3 of them in detail, while noting that more formats are easy to add. The format describes both morphology as well as behavior. Looking at this figure, FramSticks model joints and muscles separately. In FramSticks, joints merely provide a dampened bending axis, unlike Sims where forces are applied directly to the joints, making them seem more like muscles. Instead, the FramSticks model introduces bending and rotating muscles. Unlike real muscles in later works, including muscles such as Leymarie et al., these simulated muscles are not only contractive, but are capable of both pushing and pulling. Animats in FramSticks have 3 senses: balance, a gyroscope, distance to food, and touch, which is detection of physical contact, collision. Figure 4 in the paper illustrates the muscles and sensors of an animate. You see it here. So Komushinsky and Rotaro Varga studies how those 3 formats, F0, F1, and F4, impact the fitness of phenotypes. F0 is a direct encoding of the animate. Mutation happens by changing an attribute or adding, removing one. Crossover is performed geometrically by using a half plane for each parent that cuts the parent in 2 and then merging the 2 halves into a new offspring. Unlike the other encodings described here, F0 allows for cycles. The direct recurrent encoding F1 in the FramSticks model manual reads like an L system string where each character results in a production. For example, the encoding x parenthesis start x comma x parenthesis end results in a stick with a branch dividing in two other sticks. In F1, mutation crossover work directly on the encoded string. Mutation modifies single elements of the string or adds or removes an element while mutation modifies single element of the string or adds or removes an element, while crossover works by swapping the parts of the string inherited from the parents. The indirect development encoding, F4, from the manual is different from F1 in two ways. First, it allows for repeated subtrees. Secondly, the interpretation of the string is different. In F1, the string describes creation parameters, while instead here, strings describe changes to the element itself that is currently being worked on. The authors compared the performance of the three genotypes in three different tests: passive height maximization, active height maximization, and locomotion velocity. The difference between passive and active height maximization is that no neural networks are activated in the passive tests. The authors find that F1 and F4 perform better in the height maximization test. At the same time, there's no statistically meaningful difference between the three models when it comes to locomotion velocity. One particularly interesting speculation from this work is that since F1 uses a direct, F0 uses a direct representation, it is not restricted by the mapping from genotype to phenotype, and it does not have the same bias towards structure that the other two have. In this case, that bias was useful for growing towards a maximum height. Veenstra et al. Compare the effectiveness of a direct versus a generative encoding for evolving virtual robots. The generative encoding is based on L systems. As with many simulations of this type, fitness was measured by how far the robot can move in a horizontal direction. The authors used 20 seconds of simulation type, with the first 2.5 seconds being discarded due to some robots falling over. The direct encoding is graph-like based on the Edmore system, where nodes represent robot modules and edges connect modules in a manner somewhat similar to Sims, though the latter is an indirect representation that supports recursive structures. The generative encoding uses an L system based on a context-sensitive grammar. When comparing the performance of the encodings, the authors found only a significant difference when the virtual robots had a maximum of 5 modules. For 10 or 20 modules, the generative encoding only performed significantly better at 6,250 runs, but not at 12,000 nor at 25,000. The authors note this is a counterintuitive result, as one would expect results to be similar when the search space is similar size with fewer modules. As the search space is much larger for the direct encoding, it should be on par with the generative encoding, or close to, with fewer modules and lose effectiveness as the maximum number of modules grew. Moving on to modern works with cellular automata. In Smooth Life, Raffler argues that one of the defining features of the game of life is the glider. The creature, seen here on the right-hand side of the slide, then moves smoothly across the grid and wraps around at the edges. Raffler describes a continuous version of the game of life featuring a glider. A glider is featured here on the right-hand side, and the author approximates the Moore neighborhood of a cell with a disk, which is divided into two parts. The inner part the inner part extends to radius Ri from the center of X, and the outer part Ro also from X. This gives an inner disk of radius or width Ri, which represents the cell in Game of Life, and an outer ring of width Ri minus Ri, Ro minus Ri, which represents the neighborhood. So if we let f be the transition function and n and m be normalizing factors, then big n and m be normalizing factors, then we can define n, small n and m, as the following integrals over the entire disk as seen in these equations here. They're taken from the paper. Thus, working in a continuous domain, the authors expand the idea of the finite state machine, which normally describes the behavior of a cellular automaton, and extend that to a new continuous transition function from and to a normalized continuous domain, 0 to 1 times 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 to model the behavior of a cellular automaton in the neighborhood of X. The author gives the full definition of the transition function in their paper. Similarly, Leymarie by Chan expands upon smooth life by introducing the kernel K, which is a composite function that determines the texture and skeleton of a creature. The article defines linear both in a continuous world suitable for mathematics, as well as in a grid-based world suitable for computations. Unlike Game of Life, in Leymarie's grid-based model, cells take on normalized floating point values. The authors call this digital Game of Life versus analog linear. The basic idea is as follows. Define a unimodal monotonic function G. Goes from the domain 0 or range 0 to 1, mapped from -1 to 1. Oh, sorry, I see in the slide this is supposed to be a -1. Assume that at time t we have the outline of a creature AT in the Moore neighborhood N of a cell X. Then we can apply G to the result of applying K to AFT in order to calculate the next generation as shown in equation 3. So that becomes the step. Finally, the term G applied to KAT at X at the point X expands to an integral over the Moore neighborhood of A, which, due to the discrete nature of a computer, is approximated by a summation over the cells. If we let n be the Moore neighborhood of a cell X, then K at T of X is calculated inside a computer shown in equation 4. Here, this slide shows a glider in Leymarie. According to the author, the animates, or life forms as the author refers them to, turns out to be rather resilient to collisions and deformations. This is in contrast to Game of Life, where the ecosystem of animates often seem to be a bit brittle and easy to disrupt. In the next work, the author follows up with further analysis of the creatures with identifications of self-replicating and pattern-emitting creatures, as well as generally identifying creatures in 3D and in 3D. And he concludes, somewhat surprisingly, there seems to be fewer stable creatures in 3D, and that they tend to be more stationary and rotate less. So, gene regulatory networks, or GRNs, like cellular automata, are modeled with cell assemblies, but instead of having a set number of cells, GRNs often start with a single cell or very few cells and then grow this number over time through a diffusion process. Beginning with the work of Eggenberger, where 3D structures based on GRNs are developed, Bongard and Pfeiffer evolved virtual creatures using a similar technique. The agents in their simulation evolve through structural division. They start with a single sphere that, upon doubling its size, splits into two default sized spheres. Then the growth splits process iterates, so on and so forth. Even though the creatures are modeled with spheres, it's easiest to think of these as being modeled in a local voxel space. Each voxel has the 6 voxels along the 3 primary axes as neighbors. During development, genes diffuse to these neighbors, so when a sphere splits, the copy diffuses to the neighboring voxel with the highest concentration of growth genes. Adjacent voxels are connected through a 1D rotational joint, though the joint will be rigid if the local structure does not have a motor neuron. Other forms of neurons include sensors, touch, proprioceptive, and light, as well as output signals that can be constant or harmonic. Neurons are connected through a synaptic structure. Both neural networks and morphology are modeled as part of this technique. The authors evolved animats both for locomotion and block pushing, and they used the math engine for simulating the phenotypes. Joachim Chuck et al. Produced gene regulatory networks and neural networks, bridged gene regulatory networks and neural networks with their exploration and simulation of soft-bodied animals. In the original work, an artificial GRN or AGRN is developed to create 3D cellular structures to solve the French flag test, which is a challenge to create a cellular pattern separated into red, blue, and white zones. In their next work, the authors modify their initial solution by limiting it to 2D and adding cellular functions to represent springs. When the genotype is mapped to a phenotype, the authors start by building a cell structure. A border is then created around the structure by adding edges between neighboring cells sitting at the limit of the structure. The rest of the structure is then triangulated by selecting the center of each cell as the vertex and polygonized using the Delaunay triangulation. As a final step, the Gabriel subgraph of the triangulation is found and used as the final shape structure. For physical simulation, edges between 2 points in a triangle mesh also function like springs in a spring mass system, where the vertices all have equal mass. As the initial implementation only simulates swimming, forces for fluid drag are computed and applied directly before the integration step is calculated, using the bullet physics engine. Just like Sims, an individual's fitness is measured as the distance traveled by the center of the mass of the animate. The author later expand this work with walking and swimming toward a target. The authors. Okay. Excuse me. Artificial neural networks, or ANNs, are often used for simulating the behavior of animals. This can be traced back to Sims and has continued to the present day. In 2007, Stanley defined the term Compositional Pattern Producing Network, CPPN, which is an artificial neural network where signaling can be modeled with a number of different functions instead of only sigmoids. As discussed earlier, Sims had already used such networks for behavioral control, though Stanley was the first to define the term and use them for modeling morphology. In the initial work, Stanley used CPPNs for generating 2D images. From 2010 and onwards, Auerbach and Bongard published a series of works using CPPNs for generating animats. The original work used CPPNs for generating 3D structures made of spheres, where all structures were rigidly attached to each other, and the only movement consisted of falling using gravity. In the next update, the structures were able to move on their own accord via 1D rotational joints sitting between selected sphere elements. Whether a joint is created or not depends entirely on one of the outputs of the CPPN. Neural networks are not used for the brain. Instead, movement is generated with a periodic sine function. Each joint has an associated constant that offsets the central periodic sine function's local output. Moving on to soft body simulations. A large group of works focus on soft body simulations. This started around 2010 with Hillard et al., though the research area has taken on a life of its own since then. We have chosen a selection of works relevant to the morphology of virtual creatures. In Kouchi et al.'s overview on soft robotic developments, they introduce a number of concepts from biology into soft body simulations, such as morphological computation, morphosis, embodied intelligence, and development plasticity. Hillard focused on the software generation of soft body creatures, which gives a few more advances, which given a few more advances in physical materials, can potentially be 3D printed. They describe two different contributions. One, the generation of soft body virtual creatures using density functions, and two, a physics system that can simulate such creatures. The authors denote their soft body virtual creatures as continuous amorphous robots. A single creature consists of a C0 continuous 3D surface without any holes. Comparing to Sims, the animats can be conceptually mapped to continuous amorphous robots by replacing the genotype node link graph with the material distribution and the joints or actuators with the material. The authors use two different materials in their work, a passive one and one that can expand and contract, causing the creature to move while changing volume. Each density function represents one material. A surface is created by taking the maximum of all density functions at a given point in a lattice. The material represented by the density function with the highest value at a given point is the material instantiated at that point. Any method that can represent a density function can be used for generating a phenotype. The authors examined three different methods: the discrete cosine transform with DCT, the compositional pattern producing network, covered before, as well as a Gaussian mixtures representation. The DCT is a special case of the Fourier transform, where the genotype consists of a 3D matrix of frequency amplitude weights. The weights are inversely mapped and summed through an inverse Fourier transform. In the CPPN case, a network with weights is evolved, which takes a 3D position as input and outputs a density weight as its singular value. The GMX is a composition of Gaussian functions with a center in the lattice and different forelofts, as well as a weight that can be either negative or positive. The authors measured the performance of these three representations and found that the GMX representation outperformed the other representations consistently. Like Wienstra et al. And Hiller et al., Cini et al. Look at the effect different genotype encodings have on the performance of evolutionary development. How quickly does the fitness score improve after each generation? Rather than use DCT, CPPN, or GMX as Hiller et al. Did, Cini et al. Test a direct representation and a CPPN need representation. They find that CPPN need outperforms the direct encoding. Note that Auerbach and Bogart had already shown that CPPN need is useful for involving virtual 3D structures. We also note that it would have been useful that they also test GMX in order to compare their best results to those of Hiller et al. As future work, Cini et al. Also suggests trying out the hyperneed algorithm, as it has shown itself to be useful for evolving ANN-based behavior controllers for robots. Cini et al. Also try out the following four different penalty functions for the fitness function to see if it would have an impact on evolution: amount of voxels, amount of actuable material, adjoining faces between voxels, and no penalty function. Generally, the authors found that while the penalty function does drive morphological evolution, it doesn't influence the overall performance of the algorithm. The voxel-based soft-body creatures consist of two different types of voxels: active and passive. Active voxels contract and expand at a specified frequency, while passive voxels are either soft or hard. Nearly all simulations involving swimming animats have used a simple drag model to simulate a fluid environment. This completely ignores other important aspects such as the pressure of a fluid on a creature's body. Using the physics engine LiquidFun, Johnson et al. Tested swimming pseudo-soft body agent in two types of simulated liquids. One created with a drag only, like earlier simulations, and one simulating liquid using particles. The swimmers are pseudo-soft body agents, as the agents are created as small spring mass models with a hard polygonal skin, which is used for a rigid body physics simulation with a particle-based liquid. The authors created two types of agent. One is a small triangle with connected springs with prismatic joints in between them to drive the motion, while the other type has two chambers that can be compressed to push out particles and drive the movement forward. The authors found that the triangular swimmer did not move at all in the drag model if the rate of contraction of the springs matched the rate of expansion. However, turning worked quite well. It could move in the particle-based liquid, but only if the actuation frequency exceeded a certain threshold. The agent with the compressed chambers where it was only tested in the particle liquid and moved well, but with a high turning radius, as opposed to the earlier one. It's also noted that turbulence occurred in the particle-based liquid, which an agent could potentially take advantage of. Kriegman et al. Used the voxelize physics engine to test out continuous development during the lifetime of an individual, part of the EvoDevo family of algorithms. They conclude that their model results in more robust behavior controllers. They test out their 4x4x3 voxel soft robots and compare them with an Evo model. Each voxel is interpolated linearly in size during its lifetime from start size A to the end size B, which implies A equals B in the Evo model. This interpolation causing a change of shape in the phenotype is exemplified in figure 8 in the paper. The model uses separate representation for morphology and control. For the EvoDevo model, both morphology and control parameters are interpolated across the lifetime of the robot. The authors find that the EvoDevo model always converges significantly faster than the Evo model, unless the mutation rate is increased to a level where it results in random search. In particular, the EvoDevo model loses very little fitness if the final generation is rerun without development enabled, and it still outperforms the Evo model. It is also noted that the behavior controllers are quite brittle in that they are susceptible to changes in morphology. In comparison, by using EvoDevo, behavior controllers are evolved, which are more robust to changes in morphology. Additionally, Kriegman et al. Used the VoxCAD simulator as part of a pipeline for creating living in vivo soft body robots. CBPNs are used for describing the genotype, where the network maps a 3D coordinate in local genotype space to two values: a Boolean, indicating the presence of a material, and two, a descriptor of the material as contractive or passive. In some of the experiments, they used a second CBPN to phase offset for actuation. This way of using CBPNs is similar to Kriegman et al.'s earlier work, though in this work they used the age fitness Pareto optimization algorithm for simulating evolution. The complete pipeline for in vivo robots can be seen in figure 9 in the paper. In this model, they still only have one representation of the genotype, but two versions of the phenotype, one in silico and one in vivo. The robot has its fitness measured at both stages. The in vivo phenotypes are built from cells extracted from embryos. The process of growing and shaping is a combination of using chemical processes and surgery using microcautery and surgical forceps, and is described in depth in additional materials by the authors. Conceptual blending. In 2003, Ribeiro et al. And Pereira and Cardoso applied conceptual blending as a computational creativity model. Conceptual blending is a model for how concepts are grouped separately in the human consciousness in what are called mental spaces. For example, the mental space wolf could hold the concepts furry, forelegs, pointy teeth, tail, carnivorous, and more. Mental spaces and mappings between the concepts they contain can be used to create new mental spaces. For example, imagine two mental spaces, human and wolf, which can be blended together to create the space werewolf by mapping between similar concepts in each space, such as the number of legs, teeth style, diet, physiology. Conceptual blending requires a minimum of 4 mental spaces: 2 input spaces or source spaces that we want to blend, a target or blend space, and a general space that functions as a knowledge base. Building on such notions, Pereira and Cardoso described Divago, an implementation of conceptual blending as a computational creativity framework. They focus on the implementation and use of optimality pressures, as introduced by Forcanier and Turner, to generate blends between a horse and a bird. Sorry, I need to just have some tea. In essence, the different optimality pressures end up as weights for an evolutionary algorithm with searching for appropriate blends. Ribeiro et al. Provide a Divago-inspired implementation consisting of 4 submodules: input, creature builder, game knowledge base, and output. One of their goals is to make a practical system. So for example, when the creature builder starts to build the concept mapping, user-controlled restrictions can be applied to those mappings. For creating the blend itself, like Pierre and Cardoso, they implement optimality pressures as weighted constraints to assemble the fitness function. After the genetic algorithm has converged on a result, the blended model goes through 2 additional phases in the creature builder: elaboration and validation. Elaboration excuse me. Yes, excuse me. So, after the genetic algorithm has converged on a result, the blended model goes through 2 additional phases in the creature builder: elaboration and validation. Elaboration uses the knowledge base to access extra features, for example, add feathers to a bird, or apply game-specific rules, such as if a blended character ends up only on one leg, a wooden leg is added. So, Pathak et al., moving on from the conceptual blending, Pathak et al. Produced an original platform where virtual robots can assemble and disassemble dynamically to reconfigure themselves during simulation. According to the authors, monolithic controllers tend to perform poorly as the number of limbs grow, and so they set out to see if modular controllers generalize better than monolithic ones. In their work, all robots start as individuals, each consisting of 1 limb and 1 motor. All limbs exist as individual robots, and each is controlled by a neural network that outputs torque, designating how much the limb rotates. In order to create more advanced morphologies, the limb can attach and detach themselves from each other's motor joints via magnetism. The limbs create a common policy network when attached. They call this mechanism a dynamic graph network, or GGN. Since the topology can dynamically change during simulation when limbs attach and detach, rewards are shared when limbs have attached together to form a more complex structure. The authors create 2 baselines to compare against. Both are based on a multilytic policy network, where one has a static morphology and the other a dynamic one. Calculating the mean reward across the types of tasks, standing up with no wind, standing up with wind, and locomotion across a bumpy terrain, the authors show that GGN performs better with a maximum of 2,500 steps. One of the things that is missing from the author's baseline test is that since a direct representation has been shown to underperform compared to an indirect one, including a monolithic indirect representation for comparison, including a monolithic indirect representation for comparison would have made the work more complete. Finally, the authors also always trained with 6 limbs, but show that the approach generalizes to robots with 3 to 12 limbs with no extra training, never performing worse than 62% of the original score. Here is a table from the paper showing all the ALife inspired works that are included in the paper. We categorize them by dimension, the type of phenotype, are they rigid or soft bodies? What are the main techniques? Is it cellular automata L systems, artificial neural networks, CPPNs, gene regulatory networks, and so forth? And in the last column, we show where we have known, we list the simulation framework. So, lastly, we talked about a couple of game technologies so far. The conceptual blending was used for video games, video game technology, and then there was Darwin's avatars based on the ESP method. However, many games, including games like Pets and Black and White, Spore, and No Man's Sky, also include procedurally generated or modified morphology for some or all the creatures in the game. The methods that games apply for this effect are all hybrid. as they are composed of several different methods to get the desired look and behavior. It is important to differentiate between games that generate the creatures almost from scratch, or at least from basic primitives, against games that procedurally modify existing human-made models. For example, the creatures in black and white can grow up and modify their physical look based on their physical health and moral attitude. However, all modifications look like they are made to the same base model. Evolver is another example of a game that is not covered in the study, as the morphological changes all look to be taking place to an existing model. The focus in this work is on algorithms of the more fundamental approach, where a template of the procedurally generated morphologies has not been modeled beforehand. This can mean either generating the creature from nothing, or procedurally assembling it from basic primitives. Most games that qualify for our definition of procedurally generated morphology, the Spore, No Man's Sky, and Impossible Creatures, use the latter method. However, not much knowledge has been made publicly available on the implementation of the procedural techniques driving most of these games. One standout exception is Spore, for which Heger has made a lot of information available, along with Compton, Gingold, DeBry, Wilmot, Smith, and Quigley. Spore is a game featuring the evolution of creatures. The game spans 5 different evolutionary stages, all of which feature different gameplay and mechanics. Causing great debate, Spore ended up being more of a game featuring evolutionary elements than a game about evolution. With an overview of the creature pipeline in Spore, Compton shows how implicit surfaces are generated around a 3D graph of a skeletal hierarchical structure. From this representation, UV maps are extracted for procedural painting and animations are generated. Heger reports about his contribution to Spore, where he describes this pipeline in more detail. Since players can attach and detach body parts in the editor, a robust model that could change the creature morphology dynamically was needed. Heger used implicit surfaces for modeling the body parts. At the time, the patent on the matching cubes algorithm was still valid, so Heger chose to use an ear clipping algorithm for the dynamic triangulation of the implicit surfaces. The implicit function used for modeling the surfaces is a variation of the one given by Triquet et al. For animation, bone weights for vertices are generated by identifying which part of the creature an implicit function describes. Spore's innovative animation system is described in Heger et al. As the users can create their own creatures from simple parts, the central issue facing the developers was how to make an animation for a skeleton that wasn't known a priori. The developers came up with a semantics-driven system where general animations can specialize whenever they are applied to a specific skeleton and morphology. To help this specialization along, semantic capabilities, or tags, can be applied to body parts. For example, the body associated with a hand mesh has the grasper capability. The authors report that they have tested the system on hundreds of creatures and over 1,000 different animations, with a pass rate of approximately 90%. Spore's art director Quigley wrote a couple of blog posts on the texturing system of Spore. Quigley drew a set of creatures with example textures that the team wanted to be able to reproduce using the texturing system. Quigley goes on to describe the system, which ended up using particle systems where particles act as virtual paintbrushes, painting the surface of a creature as the particles move. The system included a certain amount of artistic control, so particle systems could be directed, for example, to move along the spine of a character or towards specific features. This system is for general or ambient texturing and doesn't cover detailed texturing. Eyes, teeth, and the like were all still painted by hand. For the user, the system appears to work directly on the surface of 3D creatures. In reality, behind the scenes, a 2D texture atlas is automatically generated and mapped onto the model. Table 3 provides an overview of the games and game technologies presented in detail in the paper. So we have already covered what is most likely the most well-known uses of creating virtual creatures for artistic purposes. Kawaguchi's spiral shapes, Sim's evolved creatures, and Latham and Todd's evolutionary art. Some of the Rife works, such as Ray's aesthetically evolved pets, are artful projects. Other ALife works, such as Chan's Linear, also possess a particular artistic look. However, in the following we will cover some of the more artistic virtual creature projects that do not easily fall into any of the other categories. Form was a project by Robotham, inspired by Dawkins and Todd and Latham. Just like the latter project, this project is built on basic geometric forms, which can have mathematical operations applied to them. Some of the shapes generated by Form can be clearly recognized as being inspired by Todd and Latham. However, mutations are inspired more by Dawkins' work, as the structure itself is left as is, but the genes modify parameters instead. Robotham presents 5 different iterations of the project, ending up with a final version that supports animations and interpolating between forms. With a project placed somewhere between ALife and art, 2 and Tatopolis set out to simulate a fishbowl, a complete ecosystem of autonomous fish, including morphology, motor control, sensor perception, simulation of hunger, breeding and hunting, as well as additional behaviors such as schooling. The model described here is more of a hybrid method, as often seen in art projects or games, where several disparate techniques combine to create convincing morphology and behavior. The movements of the fish themselves are modeled using a biomechanical spring mass system with motors attached to specific muscle springs to facilitate turning. There are 3 motor controllers: turn left, turn right, or go straight. Pectoral fins that can turn up and down, like the small tailed wings on the back of an airplane, are used to create full 3D controls. The graphical model of the fish is separate from the physics-driven spring mass representation of the model. The fish are modeled using non-uniform rational B-splines or NURBS in the Elias 3D modeling package. For visualizing the mesh, the authors created a custom tool for UV texture and coordinates to map photographs of real fish onto the NURBS mesh. The simulated biomechanical spring mass model is subsequently mapped onto the NURBS surface, which gives the visual impression of a swimming fish. For input to behaviors, the fish not only have a sense of touch through collision detection, but the authors have also added sight and sensitivity to temperature. Sight is modeled mostly through a combination of raycast and occlusion tests. Fish have also variables that help determine behavior, such as hunger, fear, and libido, as well as a type which can be predator or pacifist. Together with a few designer-determined attributes such as preferences for light, darkness, warmth, cold, schooling, and gender, this completely determines the fish's general behavior. Together, the perception system and attribute variables combine into a dynamic brain that results in behavior in the simulation. Table 4 in the paper lists all the artful projects. As you see, they've been categorized by which dimension they work in, mostly 3D, and if they have rigid body or hybrid models, and then also we listed the main techniques that they use. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about that today, but the paper also has includes a long big survey on simulations and ecosystems, which also talks about different diversity algorithms. So these papers are listed here and the references, and you can see a description of them in our work before maybe looking them up in the papers themselves. Similarly, our survey also includes comparisons between genotype representations. We talked about a few of those. There's a summary in the paper. So in conclusion, we have presented a swath of different works stemming from a diverse set of disciplines, all with the commonality that they focus on the generation of virtual creatures, other than human forms, which would require their own survey. In an attempt to give a more cohesive presentation, these works have been divided into 3 main groups. We talk about art, games, and ALife. Games and ALife works are often at the epicenter of a continuum, where games tend to focus on where often at the opposite end of continuum, where games tend to focus on the outcome of algorithms and the desire of the creating agent. In ALife, the focus is on the process of evolution and development. The aesthetics of the final creation is often less important as long as the fitness function has been optimized. Artworks tend to exist in a continuum between the two, as many artists are interested both in the process as well as having some influence on the aesthetics of their creation. Most works focus on the development of individual animates, with crossover being the only social element, assuming the authors don't only use mutation, in which case there's no social element. However, social interaction and competition also affect evolution, so some works take a more open-ended evolutionary approach by modeling environments where the creatures have to compete for resources and where they can influence each other and the environment. We have therefore included a section on simulations and ecosystems relevant for the generation of virtual creatures. Looking towards the future of virtual creature development, the clearest one seems to be in art, games, and entertainment, as recent ALife methods involving animate morphology instead tend to focus on applications in physical robotics. On the games industry side, applications such as Houdini from Side Effects are empowering creators with easy access to generative methods. One such art project is covered in our paper also. Additionally, looking at machine learning, there's a possible trajectory where a computational agent can become either the sole creator or colleague when creating virtual creatures for video games. Whether more advanced methods from ALife, such as CPPNs, will be experimented with by game developers will depend on designers' willingness to give up authorial control in exchange for a variety of options. Alternatively, it may be that computational power and algorithmic improvements increase to a point where designers can use these advanced techniques to directly create or tweak their creations without waiting or losing authorial control. Finally, one domain that could offer new perspectives is from developmental biology itself. Up until now, the main influence in computing has been somewhat simple approximations of how genes may encode diversity and provide metaphors for simulating evolutionary differentiation, with computational methods such as provided by L systems and genetic programming. Recent work in biology point into the direction of other relevant encodings and environmental influences. This calls for a study of recent understanding in epigenetics, how phenotype modifications can be carried on by environmental conditions without involving genes per se. In particular, there's been continuous progress in recent years in the study of how various environmental conditions within, on a molecular level, and outside cells assemblies, such as provided by bioelectrical force fields and gradients, directly modulate the development of phenotypes. A line of work which has its origin in the last paper by Turing. Such studies in biology have also recognized the need to integrate recent progress in computing within their own discipline, including deep learning generative methods, predictive coding, or information theory. We thus expect a greater exchange of ideas and principles between biology and computing to take place in the near future, and having a strong influence on the further development of the field of virtual creature morphology. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? If not, please feel free to email me directly or reach out to me on Twitter. Thank you.